Hey everyone, hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. I'm just doing a quick video just to catch us up a little bit with some of the middle parts of the Civil War. It kind of sets us up for class tomorrow. I'm going to try to keep this video very quick and very tight so that way you just have a sense of some of the timeline and a couple of events in 1863 that are really crucial to understand to kind of get a better sense of the entire Civil War. Up until the point of the Emancipation Proclamation, look at the Civil War as something that historians describe as limited war. This is largely suggesting that, there was a military effort to try to gain the South, back into the Union, and maybe then to compromise on issues of slavery and things like that. But the war after the Emancipation Proclamation will become much more of a war of conquest, looking to end not only not only to bring the South back into the Union, but to end this issue of slavery, to bring a different South back into the Union. And that effort requires attacks directly on the South to directly interfere with the South's way of life. And so it creates a different type of war. Sometimes historians will describe this more as total war. We'll see by the end of 1863 a lot more Union offenses that start to move into the Southern territories, essentially not only focusing on efforts of emancipation, but also largely on destruction of the South, literally destroying plantations, lighting fire to fields and things like that by the time we see 1864. But a few things kind of in 1863, just to give us a sense. So we did talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation in class, and just to reiterate some of the key things about this, and if you look at the map on the bottom right, not all enslaved persons are emancipated, and this also doesn't end slavery. Slavery as a state power still, exists. So even if enslaved persons become emancipated, there's still possibility that states could, of course, not during the Confederacy, they're no longer states in the Union, but the power of the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't end the institution of slavery or prohibit states from having slavery. It largely, gets emancipation to some who are enslaved, largely those who are in areas of active rebellion, and also areas where the Union Army largely can emancipate people. It is kind of a twofold thing where the Union Army is emancipating people as the Union Army is traveling, but we also have enslaved persons, fleeing to the Union Army. So things happening on both levels. There always will be a Confederate line where behind that line, slavery still is occurring, and this will happen up until the end of the war. In the deep parts of Georgia or Mississippi, cotton is continuing to grow throughout 1864. There's still going to be some degree of enslavement in Texas and whatnot, right? So it doesn't have this immediate impact of, everybody all of a sudden, kind of laying down their, farm tools and becoming free, but it does create moral impetus and change of a cause, okay? And that becomes important. There's a few battles I'll mention. We're not going to go into detail with some of the battles, but the Fredericksburg campaign is a Union offensive, and it largely ends up being a Confederate victory. So a really big takeaway is after the time period of Antietam in 1862 and then emancipation, there are some large-scale battles that are taking place in the area of Virginia and Maryland, and these battles largely before July of 1863 are going toward the Confederacy, and Fredericksburg is one of these. The second battle is going to be the Battle of Chancellorsville, which goes to the Confederacy. This is a large-scale battle, and the perception is after these battles, General Lee seems to be invincible, seems to have a much better handle on his forces and the ability to kind of command these victories, and the Union seems to be, shifting generals around, and there's a great deal of Union, lack of morale. So the morale moving into like June of 1863 is very, very low on the Union side, and the Confederacy is kind of feeling the rise of this powerful sense that they have been vindicated in a few battles. Lee does lose, Stonewall Jackson in the Battle of Chancellorsville, so there are some hits and losses that the Confederacy takes, but they have at this point in the Battle of Chancellorsville, kind of in early 1863, there's a draft happening in the Confederacy, so some resupplies. The Confederacy will always be less supplied. The Union will rely a lot on local communities for supplies, basically having to steal or somehow negotiate for supplies from local communities. But the Battle of Chancellorsville is maintaining a high degree of morale and maybe even invincibility on the part of Lee. The Battle of Gettysburg is often looked at as a turning point, and it's useful to take a look at this. The battles are happening, the battles we're talking about are in the East. There's also campaigns happening in the West in which the Union is going to be much more victorious. So, the war maybe on a larger scale, arguably gets really won around the Mississippi River because some of those wins create really significant consequences. But the Battle of Gettysburg is noteworthy for a few reasons. One is it's a Confederate offensive. So this is generally saying that he wants to invade, the North. One, to shock the North. So this is not only an invasion of the North, it's going to be as far north as Pennsylvania. So this is kind of taking the war to a whole new space, where it really hadn't been before, creating a great deal of shock. And Gettysburg is a small town at this time, and Lee and his men are looking to gain some supplies there, and as they're there, they recognize that the Union forces are not that far away, and over time, these forces mass up. And so another significant, thing about the Battle of Gettysburg is the scale of the battle. Both forces have most of their eastern men, in this battle. And so the scale of it is massive, takes place over the course of 3 days. And Lee is hoping that this will be the decisive battle, that if he wins this battle, that ultimately he could gain impact on the, and have the Northern Union basically declare defeat, and the Southerners and the will largely go on their way. The battle kind of, looks something like the image here in terms of the Union creating largely a fishhook formation where they have some of the higher ground. The area of Gettysburg is, there's a college there, if you ever get a chance to visit, lots and lots of rolling hills, on a hot day in July, you get exhausted, walking around Gettysburg, but you can kind of see where the Union has created, in a sense, this top of the hill protection where there's going to be a large-scale Union line, and the efforts of the Confederates are largely to break through the Union lines, which happens in a variety of ways. And Lee has a few generals who are trying to get through, the left and the right, and it's on the third day where we see Pickett's charge. Pickett is going to have a group of about 15,000 men on what's mostly a suicide mission to try to topple the Union line at its center, and about 2/3 of the men die. It's looked at as, maybe largely a mistake by Lee to have this particular charge, but it also does have some effect on Union forces, which have tremendous losses, but ultimately Pickett's charge, at such cost, does kind of break through the line a little, but at such a high cost. And the high cost of the battle is incredibly significant. Over the course of the 3 days, there's about 50,000 casualties. And some historians would say the Union forces could have gone further to try to, push the the Confederacy to a place of defeat. But that's not what happens. After this battle, we see Lee's army largely retreat. So the Union takes the victory because they're still standing at the Battle of Gettysburg. But there is, the Confederate army still continues. So the war goes on. Lots of people were hoping that the war would end at Gettysburg. In fact, there's a large-scale draft going on. As noted, the Confederacy has their draft in 1862. There's a lot of resentment in both cases for the draft with the Confederacy. If you were a slaveholder and you had 20 or more slaves, you could actually be exempt from the draft, so you could maintain your plantation without a slave insurrection. That creates a lot of resentment. Most of the people who are serving are individuals who don't have enslaved persons. The Union, there is a a policy in 1863. It's like a lottery system. So men of age could be drafted, but people with means could get out of it. You could pay $300 and be exempt, or you could hire a substitute. Okay, so that's going to create a lot of tension, especially amongst working class immigrants who largely become the draftees. Sorry, I cut off there for a second. Just a couple of additional comments. The draft ends up being really, really unpopular, and we see this in an example in New York City, right around the same time as the Battle of Gettysburg, right after that, July of 1863. There's a large-scale riot in New York City, and this speaks to some of the tension about emancipation, about the equality of Black Americans, and we see largely Irish immigrants who are in the position of either signing up to be recruited through the draft or taking their list to be in service. It creates a huge amount of tension around the area where people are signing up, and there's a huge mob riot, and it escalates in New York City, and it becomes a mob riot that more and more people start to join, and leads to a great deal of violence. It's something that starts in the morning, kind of largely with a protest, but then by the afternoon has led to a great deal of violence against either property or individuals in New York City. Especially, this becomes anti-Republican. So this is like a Democratic, push, and a great deal of working class Democrats, longshoremen who had seen themselves as being penalized, because African Americans were starting to be hired for jobs. There's just a great deal of resentment over largely economic issues, but the violence is incredibly horrific. About 11 Black Americans are lynched. An orphanage with about 200 African American children is destroyed. And there's a great deal of violence where people are chased largely throughout the area of New York City and, killed in really, really public horrific ways, and the public, shouting, screaming, becoming, really, really part of this horrific violence. It is probably one of the largest examples of domestic violence and civil unrest that we have in American history, and it speaks to a great deal of the tension that's, rising over issues of racial equality. Abolitionists are also targeted at this, so there are specific abolitionist homes and individuals. People are killed for being abolitionists, and people who are looking to protect, for example, the kids in the orphanage are also victims of violence. So it speaks to challenges in terms of the anti-slavery abolitionist, movement and the pushback against it, and really, really horrific. There's a rising group of people also who become known collectively as Copperheads. These are peace Democrats. They were actually pretty common in the Bergen County area, largely because these would be people who had economic interests, in some cases in New York City. Maybe they were in textiles, maybe they were in banking, but really didn't want a war, wanted there to be an armistice and compromise. And in 1863, some of these Copperheads become very, very loud. Clement Vallandigham in Ohio becomes a significant example, and President Lincoln, who is of the opinion that some of the Copperhead protests could become problematic for larger morale, takes it upon himself to try to squelch some of the dissent. And in some cases, this means, pushing people into the Confederacy, largely taking away some of the Copperheads' freedom of speech, or placing them in a situation where they are arrested and jailed without being given reason for why. So there are some maybe unconstitutional things that Lincoln does in order to squelch some of the dissent of Copperheads. But New Jersey was like a hotbed of Copperhead activity, and it kind of speaks to a movement of the Democratic Party. And we actually see after emancipation, there's some elections that happen in Congress, and Democrats actually win a lot of those elections. So it speaks to some of the debate that's happening in the North. Okay. And last thing, I think we'll leave it there. We'll talk about the siege of Vicksburg tomorrow. Some of the other things that we'll look at kind of toward the end of the war, and then we'll close up the topic. Okay. Be well, everyone, and I'll see you in class. if you get a chance to look at the Gettysburg Address, that's delivered in November. The Gettysburg Address is largely a speech that Lincoln gives. It's very short to kind of make the Gettysburg battlefield a cemetery. So it doesn't have any legal effect, just a speech to commemorate.